Welcome back. The Wagner mercenary group boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, is believed to have been killed in a plane crash in Russia. The flight was on the way from Moscow to St. Petersburg when it crashed, and Russian authorities say there are no survivors. Joining us with more on this is Associate Professor Matthew Sussex. He's from ANU's Centre for Defence and Strategic Studies. Matthew, good to see you. Thanks for your time. This is coincidental, isn't it? Surely there's a pretty low probability that this plane crash was an accident.
Oh, yes. Look, I think there's absolutely no one who's going to believe that this was some kind of accident. So in many respects, it doesn't really matter what it is, well, whether it is. In terms of Prigozhin himself, I think there's also been a fair bit of surprise that he's lasted as long as he has since his kind of bizarre march for justice, where his armoured convoy got almost 2 hours from the gates of Moscow, virtually unchallenged. So he's been kind of on borrowed time.
Absolutely. Well, that uprising was 2 months ago, as you point out. So why do you think that Putin waited so long to finish him off, if that's what has happened here?
Oh, look, it's an interesting question. There's a lot of speculation about why he would be allowed to remain alive so long, particularly because Putin gave him a very public and personal assurance, a guarantee of his own safety. And that's a really significant departure from what Putin has done previously for those who are close to him. Previously, it would be that, Putin, if he said he had your back, he would stick by it. But this is going to be definitely taken as revenge and retribution for what he did. And there's speculation that Putin has waited a while because he's wanted to see how deep the rot was. Wanted to see, particularly within the Russian armed forces, how many people are sympathetic to the Wagner group. And it's really interesting that on exactly the same day, pretty much the same time, in fact, that Prigozhin's plane went down, the Russians removed General Valery Surovikin as chief of the Air Force. And he was the guy who disappeared about 2 months ago out of being suspected of being complicit of working with Prigozhin.
Is it fair to say that few will feel too much sympathy for Prigozhin himself? By all accounts, he wasn't the nicest man. He profited from misery, by the sounds of it, for a very long time.
Absolutely. He dealt in suffering and death. Those were his main sort of stock in trade. Prior to being head of Wagner, he was in charge of the Russian Internet Research Agency, which was all about sort of sowing misinformation and disinformation in the United States as well as in Europe. But typically he's had scant regard for human life. He was, glorified in the execution of Wagner deserters with sledgehammers, even going so far as to say, the sledgehammer should be our totem. But that said, within Russia, there are people who regard him as a patriot and as a hero and as a strong commander. So particularly amongst Russian nationalists, his death will actually be missed. Elsewhere, I think perhaps not.
So what now happens to Prigozhin's private army, this mercenary group? Does it disband? Is there a successor in the wings who might be keen to take revenge on Putin on Prigozhin's behalf? It sounds like a TV show, doesn't it, Matthew?
It is. It's a really bizarre melodrama that we've seen playing out in real time, happening in Russia. Now, look, Wagner itself is probably at the moment pretty rudderless, because in addition to Prigozhin, the co-founder of Wagner, a man called Utkin, who was responsible for the combat operations, he was on the plane too. And so too the sort of person in charge of image, messaging, rear area security, that kind of thing. So you've had, the chief leadership of Wagner wiped out pretty much at a stroke. But Wagner remains important for Russia, particularly in Africa. And of course, Prigozhin's last video message was from Mali saying, we're recruiting and we've got work to do here in Africa. So, they're going to have some kind of presence. It may well be that another Russian private military company will step in and fill the void, or alternatively, Wagner carries on kind of under new leadership. But we'll have to wait and see. It's really too soon to tell for that one.